Good morning, everybody. We have a real special. Hello, everybody. Hello. How is everybody doing? Are you hungry?
Yeah.
But you have to sit here and listen to it, right? It's that sickness, no? Yeah. Well, I can tell you it's going to be very exciting. You won't even notice that 3 hours went by. So, my name is Miller. You may not know me if you came here yesterday or something. So I'm professor in computer science department, director of BC Cybersecurity Center, and I have a great pleasure of introducing Mr. Mike Watson. Mike Watson is Chief Information Security Officer, or some call it CISO. There's many ways to pronounce it, for Virginia. So Virginia IT, or sometimes they just call it Vita.
Yep.
And Mike has really fantastic experience that and examples that he will share with you. And I'd like to invite you to not only listen, but also participate, discuss, ask questions. Between the lines, what this means is that Mike is really in charge of all state agency communication, cybersecurity, everything, which is a lot. So now I will ask you one thing that is a little bit different than before. If you can come here and we take a photo before everybody runs away, including me, that'll be wonderful. So we have a beautiful memory. Can you guys come here? Just stand anywhere you like.
At least my wife wrapping me, so somebody was like, all the very quick.
Yeah, it's fine. I would like to. So, but yes,
So we're gonna squeeze, right?
this is not the iPhone 17. So, I think when they get.
Yeah, I guess.
You guys were there, but you can come on this side. These are friendly guys. Bravo.
Oh, sorry.
Good. No, they're starting not to look so friendly. I'll squeeze in here.
Are always some short people at the back, like Allison, and
Yes, come.
make sure your face is. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Good enough?
Excellent.
Thank you.
I'm not counting.
Thanks for indulging that. I appreciate it. It's always good to have proof I actually was doing something today. So I'm glad that you guys can help with that. Thank you very much for the introduction, Dr. Frank. Appreciate it. My name is Mike Watson. I am the security officer for Commonwealth of Virginia. I work at the Virginia IT agency. And thank you very much for having me here today. So generally, I do presentations because I'm going to kind of give you a general overview of stuff. I am happy to take this wherever it is that you guys want to go. So if you have questions or you want to know more about a particular area, I am happy to dive into it. I'm pretty okay about going on the fly, so don't hesitate to say, hey, I really want to learn more about this. I try not to toot my own horn too much. I am the longest serving CISO in the country. I've been doing this for a very long time at this point. So I have a lot of experience and understanding both on the government side as well as on the technical side, and kind of how the cybersecurity industry has evolved, over the last umpteen years, depending on when you count started. A little bit of background as far as who I am and what I've been doing for what feels like ever at this point. I got started at JMU a little bit further down the road, and I went and got my master's at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm working on my PhD with Dr. Frank, and a few other wonderful folks in the room. So we are. So I've been kind of interested in a lot of this stuff for a really long time. And have been working in the field for a while. Let's see. So a little bit about the organization. It's a little bit difficult, right? Government is weird. There's a lot of complicated parts to it. I kind of use a little bit of a slide to kind of give you the scope of what it is that we deal with. when you look at actually data centers and everything else, we have a whole bunch of different data centers out there. We've got 5 when you start counting the different cloud ones. We have 65 different agencies. What that really means is 65 different lines of business. That's everything from hospitals to museums to random other organizations, law enforcement, all sorts of different stuff, economic development. So we run the gamut, right? We get a whole bunch of different exposure out there to different business types. We have over 100,000 employees, so we've got a lot of folks that are on the ground, a lot of data protect, 60,000+ systems, 25,000 phones. You just start making up large numbers at this point. The number of data, like managed storage stuff, is kind of a moving target. That's not even close to correct at this point. But the slide kind of does a decent job of talking. We touch every county in the state, so we've got a pretty large geographic area that we end up covering as well. So there's just the kind of concept is there's just a lot, right? My organization breaks into 2 different things. There is a operations role, which is the typical thing where you say, I've got the people behind the keyboards looking for the attacks coming in. We've got governance roles, which are kind of looking to say, how do we structure and define what good cybersecurity is? What do we consider good cyber hygiene in the environment? And then we've got risk management roles to say, okay, how much risk are we going to take on for the business for whatever it is the objective that we're trying to meet? And a lot of that is discussing this is explanation for folks to be like, how bad is it going to get if I do this, right? Very simple example of what risk management is, kind of across the board. Some of the stats and things I like to kind of share about what the cyber piece is. This is a lot of words. You don't really have to worry too much about the words that are up there. The things I do like to highlight, right, is that we've seen a lot of different change and we go through periods of ebbs and flows. We've been fortunate over the last couple of years to drive down our security incidents and issues pretty low. That just means that we've done a lot of work to move all the stuff that used to kind of get in the environment out to front, so we're able to stop it pretty quickly. We have a whole bunch of different metrics and measures that we kind of use to do that. But as far as like types of things, we get 329 million attack attempts a year. That's many more per second than it matters. At some point, those numbers just become so large; they're just large numbers. And then we've got different 59,000 pieces of malware. These are different permutations of things that are trying to get in the environment to sort of infiltrate and gain a foothold in the environment. There's a little bit up there about some of the cyber program stuff. I do highlight at the bottom if anybody's ever interested in coming to the security conference that we have every year. Always open for folks to join. So yeah, a little bit about some of that. Now, that's all the stuff that's probably not necessarily just background information. This is all the stuff that hopefully you might actually take some things away. What I thought I'd start with is sort of like cybersecurity overview, very basic. I know we're all coming at it from different angles. We all have different backgrounds. Some folks may be familiar with how it works and some may not. But there are generally, cybersecurity is basically broken up into these 4 different categories. And you heard me talk a little bit about them already. First thing is cyber hygiene. It's the stuff that we do to take care of our systems, right? There's a reason it's called hygiene. It's the same type of concept like we do to take care of ourselves. We also do this on our system. It's the patching, it's the installing, firewalls, it's all the technical stuff that we do just to make sure our systems aren't going to get, infected, compromised, whatever. It's, using multi-factor authentication on your accounts. It's, making sure that you're not, doing anything silly as far as giving away information. Those are all considered cyber hygiene things. They're generally preventative measures in the environment to make sure that you're not doing something to give away access of some sort. Okay, very simple concept. So the other part that I like to talk a little bit about is what drives cyber attacks, right? So cyber attacks can actually be broken down pretty much into 3 different categories. Very straightforward, right? It's financially motivated. There's some sort of socio-political whatever that somebody's trying to make a point over. They don't like some policy. There's some cause that they're trying to advertise. Really could be any of those types of things. Or there's espionage and foreign influence. The third with the espionage and foreign influence is the hardest one to understand because what is important to somebody else, you may or may not actually know. But there's something that another country is trying to execute. Sometimes you may have read in the paper about some of the Russian influence on elections as an example of that. There have been China, Russia tend to be our biggest adversaries in the space where they end up doing and taking action in the environment. Iran is actually pretty high on the top 5 list there as well. Especially a few years ago, they tended to try to do a lot of compromise in the environment, especially in the government space. very interesting as far as like what people think are important in that government space. There's a lot of, like, when I first started in cybersecurity, there was a lot of bullet one there with the socio-political agenda. The favorite thing for people to do was to find very insecure websites and drop in some political message and then send a link out to all of their folks to say, hey, I did something, here. Eventually that switched from doing planting a flag on a device to then saying, I'm going to cause denial of service attacks on those devices. You still see some of this today, but with the amount of compute that we've got and bandwidth that we've got available, it's really hard to do denial of service attacks in the same way. Not impossible, but when people do it, it gets noticed very quickly because of the scale of resources required in order to do that. For those who may not be familiar, and I just realized that using terms, denial of service is effectively just taking whatever service it is offline. The biggest thing that you would generally see is a website all of a sudden goes offline, right? So whenever we have a website that shuts down, the first two things that people ask me is it a denial of service, or like somebody trying to overload it and bring it down, or is there some sort of malicious event where somebody's pulled it offline, generally looking at ransomware or something like that. And I'll talk about ransomware in a minute. The other thing, so the financial piece is pretty straightforward as well. Like somebody wants money. There are all sorts of different ways that financially motivated attacks happen. There are the common things where somebody's trying to get a bank account. That's the stuff that you see the most frequently, but typically is lower dollars, to more convoluted things where you actually end up seeing things like manipulation in the stock market. Believe it or not, that does happen. We've actually seen that happen in the state a couple of times. It's been really interesting to see what happens. Generally, what people are going after are partners with folks to try to drive direction in one way or another. The other thing that you end up seeing is like some sort of financial fraud. We would end up having people try to put in fake PC orders, right? Somebody says, oh, I want 10,000 PCs dropped at this location, and it's somebody's house, right? Like when you insert yourself into some of the business processes, you can sort of manipulate the structure, and cause some unintended side effects. But again, all with the concept of getting some financial gain, out of whatever action is taken. And like I said, espionage, foreign influence is a little bit more difficult to sort of go after, but people are generally looking for state secrets, or they're looking to end up getting some sort of either military or economic advantage from the information that they're taking. And that can be all sorts of different ways. There was a really interesting story a number of years ago about how we've had some federal government systems breach where they stole some of the plans for some fighter jets. There are some other smaller interesting stories about a compromise of the people manufacturing parts for some of the equipment that we put in place, where they're trying to understand how a particular part of a military apparatus works. So you have to be careful about how those things come together. What usually happens in the state and federal government space is we may be getting information about how these things work, and then we'll take that information and use it to, again, do something like compromise a partner or resource out there. So that's kind of cyber tech drivers. Risk discipline. General concept here is how much risk are we taking on in any action that we're taking, right? Cybersecurity works very much like the insurance market, right? You're trying to make sure something doesn't happen as much as possible. And when it does happen, it's usually a big event and costs a lot of money. So we do one of those things where if you never hear from me, you don't know who I am, that's a good thing, right? Because I don't want to be standing up and saying you got cyber problems all day long. Risk disciplines are always in this scenario where we're trying to prevent things from happening. Generally, you can break down in cybersecurity risks into those three areas: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is pretty straightforward. It's the stuff we're trying to keep secret. Integrity is the stuff we don't want to change, and availability is the stuff that must be running at any given point in time. That can be all sorts of different things, and it really means a lot to different folks based off the business that we're in. In government, I always say that there are parts of government that have to be up and running when everything else isn't. So we're always, trying to focus in on what those areas are. And it does shift over time, right? There are some things that are universal. We expect things like law enforcement and public safety functions to be functioning whenever there is a major emergency. But some things like our museums, maybe not, right? But there are, that will change over time as well, depending on, what's there. And you get really creative, issues that you can apply. So I'll take the museum one as an example for availability, right? When we look at risk. You would think that a museum wouldn't necessarily have really big cybersecurity problems. However, they have very large exhibits that are expensive, right? And things like HVAC, where that they have to keep those exhibits at particular temperatures, are a big deal. So if all of a sudden our HVAC systems get compromised or they get shut down remotely and we lose, a $10 million exhibit, that's not good for anyone, right? So we try to make sure that we're keeping in mind what the application of risk is based off of, those three items. And then the last part there is threat management, right? That's again, the stuff behind the keyboard. These are the ones zeros popping up on the screen. They're the SOC operators, security operations center operators, the people looking for anomalies in the system. Generally that works where something pops up, somebody's looking into, what the cause of that was or where the root of that was occurring. And then they follow a series of steps to both correlate a bunch of information together and then investigate how we contain whatever's going on, and then repair whatever security vulnerability is that allowed them in the first place. You can get really deep into a whole bunch of different stuff in there, but realistically, almost all of threat management is tied to anomaly detection. We're looking for the ghost of the machine, the weird stuff that's happening, and we don't know why it's happening, stuff that just doesn't, shouldn't be there. All right, I'm gonna pause for questions at different points. Anybody have any questions on that? I know that was more than 30 seconds. I'm really not that fast at speaking, but wanted to make sure at least we kind of level set a little bit about what cybersecurity generally was. You can apply this to anything. This is realistically, what there's all sorts of different things that cyber does, but they all fall into, those particular categories. Okay, so I didn't want to just come with like talking about cyber as just a general field. I wanted to talk a little bit about stuff that I'm hoping kind of matters more to you, but if I'm off the mark, like I said, ask me questions, tell me to talk about something else. So generally, we figured it would make sense to kind of go into history a little bit, right? And it should sound pretty familiar with kind of the stuff that we've been talking about. So cybersecurity has evolved pretty significantly over time. The easiest way that we kind of looked at things in the beginning, it was somebody did something they weren't supposed to, right? Something very basic. They would log into, or I'm sorry, they would try to drop a file or something on your system that doesn't belong there, right? And that file could do anything, right? Sometimes you had to joke things. When I was in college many, many years ago, way longer than I'd like to admit, the big thing was like you could have this. Now, this wasn't necessarily all that malicious, but a little thing that would open your CD drive for you when you weren't trying to, when you were just sitting there, and it would just, do things to like make you a little bit nuts. Or it would play sounds on your computer when you were, across the room, right? Stuff that might just be annoying, but not necessarily malicious behavior, right? So what happened is we said, oh, well, we know we can look for these things that are out there. There's only 10, 15 of them. We can develop some signatures to figure out, what is stuff that we don't want on our systems. And then we just put this in this system, this antivirus system, to figure out what those things are. And if it lands on my computer, this antivirus will stop it, right? And that basically was cybersecurity for 10 years, right? There really wasn't anything more super complicated. We added some things like firewalls in there to kind of prevent, some of the detection or the connection pieces to it to sort of try to prevent some people from getting access to things. But for the most part, that really was most of our cyber response. And then we started moving into something a little bit more complicated in the sort of anomaly detection space, where it would start with heuristic analysis. The antivirus engines would drive to more of a, hey, I don't know exactly what is going on here, but all the behavior that I'm seeing based off of this heuristic analysis looks probably like it shouldn't be there, right? It started introducing things like false positives in the environment. It started driving our process to look to see how are we connecting a series of steps or executions of processes instead of just this one file, looking for this one file that exists on the system. And then we are closer to where we are today. Now, I'll first admit, 20 years is probably a little bit too long of a period, but you get the idea. Somewhere in there, we started switching from this sort of anomaly detection to behavior analysis. In today's world, cybersecurity is way harder, and mostly because we've done a really good job of developing our systems to be really flexible, right? We want things like a single sign-on account, right? That sounds great for usability. That's really terrible for security, because once I sign in one spot, I have access to everything, right? And we've been sort of fighting some of those pieces. We've developed some really great algorithms and structures to make sure that our passwords across all these sites are being kept secure. And then we've got different, mechanisms using things like FIDO and other steps to kind of protect those passwords, and getting more creative every day. But the fact that we have this usability and security sort of like friction going on, it's pushing us to make sure that we have to focus a lot on the behavioral analysis section instead, and understand when someone's taking action, what's the intent of that action and what context are they taking that action in, right? This is probably the biggest shift. And while today it's kind of we kind of have this scenario where our systems are reasonably secure. We've kind of got a good understanding about behavior. With the introduction of some of the AI components and the structure that we're putting in place, it's going to break again. This is going to change dramatically in the next 5 years. And I'll talk a little bit about why. But yeah, so behavioral analysis is kind of the newer thing. There have been some things like basic behavioral analysis steps before. I'm not necessarily talking about I used it, I don't typically access my system at 1 a.m. It's got to be full contextual behavioral analysis, meaning that the data that you're accessing, the steps that you're taking, the system you're logging in from, all of the things combined together defines the behavior of the user in a way that we historically have not been able to actually define. So, any questions there? All right, standard cyber attack. I figured this would help also with a little bit of the context, of the actual, situation, why it is that we sort of have seen this development over time. So this is closer to where we are today, right? Indicators of compromise are exactly what they sound like. This is how we know something is, been compromised in the system. There's a really great, I use this as the example all the time, and I actually even talked about it a little bit this morning. There's this really great RSA video out there showing a medical procedure. What happened, so RSA, for those who don't know, is a giant security conference. Way too many people, but a lot of fun. What they did is they brought a doctor up on stage and they said, we're going to give you a fake patient and we're going to run through, a scenario for you. And we want you to explain to us what's happening along the way. So what happens is they bring up, volunteer on stage. The volunteer is just sitting there in this, gurney, and they hook up like a fake IV and stuff to them, and they're talking through what's happening, and the impersonating medical EMTs are sitting there reading off information to them and saying, hey, heart rate's going up, or, these stats are changing or whatever. And then all of a sudden, like they say, oh, there's this wild swing in your stats. And the doctor looks and says, I don't know what happened, but the IV bag dumped all its content all at once, into the patient. Right? She prescribes some stuff to offset what that happens. And then she basically says, look, let's just go ahead and get another, device in here to make sure that this one doesn't become a problem together. And that's the end, right? The point of all of that is that actual unit was compromised. The people that did that exercise had actually messed with the device to be able to give it a signal to create that dump. The problem is you had no idea as a doctor. There was no indicator anywhere to say, hey, this is actually a compromised unit, right? And the problem is that in our current day and age is that times 1,000, right? We've got cameras, we've got phones, we've got all of these things that don't necessarily provide signals to say that there's some indicator that it has been compromised. The only way for us to know is based off of the behavior of the device itself, right? So we've got this problem where basically we don't know stuff's broken when it is, right? You really don't want that kind of scenario to be the case if you're in a driverless car, right? You really don't want that scenario to be the case if you are trusting your critical infrastructure to any of these systems that operate. And we'll talk a little bit about a few use cases, on there later. So what that means when we talk about indicators of compromise, right? We have to figure out how to relate several events together in order to figure out that there's an actual problem. And then we've got to identify what those indicators are in full to make sure that we've removed all of the problem as well, right? It also complicates the factor where our attack goals aren't always known upfront. The example I always use is to say when a hurricane comes into the environment, we know when it starts and stops. We know exactly what the hurricane is trying to do, right? It's not sentient, but you know what I mean? It's trying to do. We know what the behaviors of the hurricane are, so we know how to respond and how to protect and prevent as much damage as possible. In these scenarios, you have no idea what's actually happening. You don't know when the event started. You don't know when, if, and when it's over. You don't know what the person's after, but you can generally make conclusions based off of the behavior and activity that the person is taking. But it doesn't mean that you're right? So there's a little bit of trying to figure out how it is to protect that. And what has made it worse over time is what we call this living off the land problem, right? I started by saying indicators of compromise are things that we tell when somebody has done something in the system that it's not supposed to. What happens when you don't do that? What happens when you actually try to use all of the normal stuff that a system does? The easiest example is if somebody steals your credentials and logs into a system that looks like you, how do I tell that it isn't you, right? That is a really hard thing to do in most circumstances because you could right now, especially like, I can't do it by where you are, right? Not only do we not always know exactly where you are, but you may be logging in from systems. We travel all over the place, right? We don't necessarily know where you are supposed to be and where you're not supposed to be. There are all sorts of different challenges that come with this concept of living off the land, where you're taking the resources that you typically use and then using them to perform some nefarious behavior. And when it trips from normal to nefarious is always what we're trying to zero in on. And that's what I said at that last step right there, is understanding behavior to activity helps us understand how to defend against this. If I know that you are after our money, I know to look for activities that are going to tie into some financial impact, right? Whether that is taking money out of an account, ordering systems like I mentioned before, or whatever else. The idea though is that understanding what that behavior does gives us a huge advantage of how it is defending the environment. Okay, so general overview of standard cyber attack. Any questions? Okay. All right. So what do we do when we actually experience a cyber attack, right? Now that you kind of seen some of the, excuse me while I drank, I just talked too much. Now that kind of know what we're doing with like what a cyber attack is and where it is, like how do we actually define and defend against it? The first thing that we always do is it works very much like any other emergency incident, right? Like I said, whether it's a hurricane, medical issue, public safety response, it's the same. There's a triaging scenario. Basically what you're doing is you're trying to contain as much damage as possible so that you can at least prevent things from getting worse. It's that first aid thing that we're all taught, where you try to make sure that the patient is not going to get injured by whatever else is around, right? Set general concept here. The first thing we usually do is to look where the initial point of entry is. Now, this isn't always easy to identify, but if you have this concept of saying, I know the resources in my environment and I can generally trust those resources in my environment, it's coming external, you at least start with your external systems. What that typically means is like you're looking at websites, you're looking at accounts for third parties, you're looking at some of those things that may come into the environment. And the next thing you do is you try to construct a timeline where you say, look, where is it that there's activities look abnormal based off of what a typical day looks like, in person. Now, again, like I said before, impersonation is a really easy way to sort of defeat, both of those components. And then, of course, the third one is try to make sure you understand what the attacker is trying to get after. That's pretty straightforward. We talked about that already. Now, once you've understood those three things to try to triage it, that next piece is defining the actual behavior about what the person is. And the key part is that, part at the bottom there, that there's got to be a connection between these events in order to understand what the behavior is. We see the biggest thing I see as in my experience with cyber folks doing investigations like this is they'll just take one part of the actual incident, one log item, one log area, and run with just that one thing. They aren't looking at what the full picture is or where there are actually connections between the different events, because they're just not sure about these things. And it's really tempting to do that. If you ever end up in this field, whether you are on the suffering end of a cyber incident or you actually do the cybersecurity part of it, do your best to recognize what this behavior piece looks like, because it really will define the difference between a good outcome and a bad outcome. Now, granted, you can't always understand it all because you're not going to be able to create all of the relationship connections out there because you just might not have all the data. But the more that you do this, the more confident you are in your answer to whatever it is that just happened in the environment, right? The events do define the behavior, but you're supposed to draw that picture based off of what all those different events are. And then, like I said, understanding the tactics and objectives are huge for trying to paint a picture about what the typical behavior of someone that's causing a problem is. So like, this is how we differentiate things like foreign nation attacks from somebody trying to take, financial information, right? Your foreign attacks, their tactics are typically what we call low and slow. They get in the environment and they wait and they watch and they learn, right? They aren't looking for a quick win. They're not looking to get money all of a sudden. They're already resourced way better than we'll ever be resourced. Like, they're not looking for some of those aspects. What they want is information. So they're content to sit and wait. Versus somebody that's in the financial bucket, they are looking to make as much money as possible, which means they're going to be quick, loud, noisy, and take advantage of the easiest opportunity. That doesn't necessarily mean they're getting big paydays every time. They are perfectly happy with many $60 interactions versus one $6 million interaction, right? Their tactics drive, how it is and what it is that they're after. So, any questions? Okay, case studies. I always like to talk examples, right? And some of these examples are a little older. I'm happy to go into newer ones if people have questions about them. I try to make sure that I'm at least up on most of what they are, but I'll say that generally almost all of the actual compromises that exist out there are repeated. They've all happened before. I haven't seen anything that's novel. The newest one that I've seen that was sort of interesting and a little bit different was some of the stuff happening with Claude, there was like a Claude kind of compromise the other day, which is a little bit different, but still generally executing these things in a very similar fashion, right? I'm going to jump around a little bit and I'll start with the target one. Target one was like, first of all, a really long time ago, but it was a really sort of good bellwether as to how much of a problem and impact one organization can have, right? Because when we talk about, remember, we look at confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. Target doesn't have a lot of stuff that they got to keep confidential. They basically have credit card numbers, right? It's really the only thing it is that they've got to hold on confidential. Well, of course, that was also where the biggest financial payout was, where people go after is the credit card numbers. But what was really interesting about the Target attack was that the way that people got into the system, right? It was a good example of bad cyber hygiene, right? Because this was in 2013, it's kind of the early stages of some of the cybersecurity pieces, but it really was one of the biggest, attacks that we had. So what happened is the bad guys were trying to get into the target environments. They couldn't do it. They couldn't get in through their external IP space. They were trying to trick some folks into executing some of the malicious software and stuff, and they weren't able to be very successful at that. But they found out that they were working with a specific third-party HVAC vendor, right? So instead of going directly after them, they went to the HVAC people who were not super trained in IT at that point in time, wasn't necessarily part of what they did every day. Maybe they didn't have great security awareness training, who knows? Whatever it was, they were able to actually get somebody to execute some files in their environment. And from there, they were then able to make a trusted connection because that HVAC company was managing all of the HVAC equipment in Target stores, not all stores, but you get the idea, in some of their stores. So they were able to follow the path from that HVAC line into the Target environment, and then they were able to plant into their point of sale systems a piece of malware that just scraped credit card numbers. So every person over a period of time, it was about, well, they say about a week, it could have been potentially longer than that, but about a week, ended up having their credit card numbers stolen, right? So we all know Target, at least I think most of us know Target. It was at the time, it was at the height of sort of popularity. It was one of an alternative to Walmart as far as the number of people that are going there. So a lot of folks were going at the time. So they had many, many, many millions of credit card numbers stolen in a very short time frame, right? This attack cost them over $1 billion, right? Between the costs of the money that they lost, the lawsuits that they had to deal with from the credit card companies, and the actual response activities that they had to put in place, it cost them about $1 billion. They also lost sales revenue for a good while there. Now, granted, one of the things that we've learned in cybersecurity is that those hits tied to reputation tend to be at least temporary, meaning that usually a few months, six months at the most, you're usually back to normal. But it does impact your bottom line, and your employers really care about what that bottom line looks like. So this is one of the sort of the very first big pieces that were there. Now, when we talk about behavioral pattern for this, those are the few major things that we've had there, right? Privilege escalation, internal reconnaissance, right? Internal reconnaissance, they were looking for ways about partners to use, right? Privilege escalation, they were looking for ways to get additional access into those terminals. They were able to find that based off of one of the systems that they dumped some malware on there. They'll scrape passwords and then jump up into the point of sale systems from there. And then they started sending off their data to Europe. Once they started scraping the cards, they were able to send them out to Europe. Most of the time, that's what happens. They don't usually keep the data in the US. It goes somewhere. Now, even in the cloud, sometime it'll go to a cloud system and then off to Europe somewhere, Europe or Asia from there. Any questions from Target one? It was relatively straightforward, kind of easy to understand. Nothing super complicated. Obviously, financially motivated attack. Yeah, that's pretty there. All right, let's see, SolarWinds, we'll do that one next. SolarWinds, there is a piece of software that is used a lot in the corporate environment to monitor systems that are out there, basically the health of the system. Is it up and running? Is it responding to pings correctly? Like, is there any network issues, whatever. SolarWinds is that particular product. And it's had a bunch of different names over time, but it's been around a really long time. So it's got a obviously large development behind it. A lot of folks have been doing work over it over time, and it had a very big footprint. So this was a good example of a nation state attack. What happened is one of the nation states was able to gain access to the code base and actually slip in a software update into that code base. Now, when I talked about the low and slow examples, this is a really, really good example. The first update they did wasn't to get a backdoor. The first update they did was to make sure that they could actually implant the code, right? They wanted to make sure that they had some access to the platform, the Orion platform that they were using to deploy a lot of their updates and stuff that were out there, right? So they sat on it. They let that to make sure that they had that access to be able to get stuff, an actual backdoor into the code. Then they let that perpetuate over time. They waited 6+ months to actually let that stuff get out there. And they know no one noticed. And then they waited, and then they took, we still don't necessarily know what particularly signaled them to do it, but they went ahead and then executed their update out to all of those systems that had that platform on it, right? So we had 18,000 organizations. That's not systems, that's organizations that were impacted because because these guys were able to get this backdoor into their updater and then have that same backdoor, similar backdoor deployed out to all of those different organizations. So by one company, they were able to compromise 18,000 different places, right? Huge number, huge deal for lots of different reasons, because of course, this was one of our biggest signals in our supply chain, where we've got these third parties that we're relying on for systems, especially more and more, right? Cloud environment, really good example of that. Our Microsoft and Amazons of the world, we are relying on them to make sure that their security is tight and that everything is working correctly. Because if it doesn't, you get stuff like this happening. The worst thing in the security space is I can't protect against this very well, right? If I can't trust the third parties that I'm working with, I've got a problem because I have to be able to run their code. I have to be able to run their services. This is one of those things that the only thing that we're able to kind of combat this right now is with reputation, right? We are expecting that people are staying on top of their security programs. We're making sure that they're taking all the steps for good cyber hygiene, right? And then we're doing our best to identify when there's going to be problems. This was one that was going to be really, really hard for them to figure out. There was no real way to understand that they were going to be compromised, or that there were compromised, or that indicators of compromise wasn't very clear in a lot of that particular attack. The indicators of compromise popped up when the organizations that received those updates started saying, hey, I'm seeing something weird. I'm seeing connections coming to your piece of software from these locations that I shouldn't see. So the behavioral detection didn't even happen in the SolarWinds organization. It happened within those people that were consuming the actual software, right? Really interesting attack, highlighted big time about what our dependencies on third parties were. And, it's reinforcing some of the challenges that we're going to have in that space, going forward. We still don't necessarily know what people got out of the attack, because 18,000 organizations relies on people reporting out what actually happened in their org, which is a little dicey in the first place. Public opinion's a thing. You don't necessarily want to admit to losing or being exposed to whatever it is that they were trying to get at. So the scope of an impact of that is always going to be somewhat limited. We did see this in Virginia. Fortunately for us, we happened to catch it before it became a problem. But we were one of the people that were able to sort of give SolarWinds feedback to say, hey, we don't understand what the heck is going on here, but this is what we're seeing. So interesting issue. Any questions on that one? Colonial Pipeline. This is the one I think I really like this one for a couple of different reasons. Anybody familiar with the Colonial Pipeline thing? 1, 2. Okay. Colonial Pipeline is pretty straightforward, right? It is a fuel pipeline that runs up and down parts of the East Coast, usually little parts of Virginia and South. One what happened is this was during pandemic times, right? So we were all, sequestered, at least somewhat sequestered to a bunch of our internal homes. But what happened is somebody compromised that pipeline and they had to shut down fuel delivery up and down parts of the East Coast, right? So we had a piece of critical infrastructure that was important for our economic stability, as well as our ability to actually, sort of run anything up and down the East Coast that got stopped. If we were not in the middle of a pandemic, this would have been huge, like way bigger than what it was. We got super lucky that this happened while there was a large majority of people doing things like remote working, because this, even with this happened where people were still, people were at home, the gas stations ran out of gas. Businesses weren't able to function. They had to shut down a whole bunch of businesses and stuff because they couldn't keep their lights on because they didn't have fuel. There were a whole bunch of ships couldn't go places. Like there's a whole huge ripple impact from just this one pipeline being shut down, right? So that impact piece it was pretty huge there, and it was only muted because that we're in the middle of the pandemic. So what happened? Ransomware. Let me give a brief primer on ransomware. It is pretty much what it sounds like. Fun fact, Virginia was one of the very first public organizations impacted by ransomware. If you want to go back to 2009, and I tried to find the 60 Minutes interview with the governor for it, I couldn't find it. But we had our Department of Health Professions that was actually impacted. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with all of the parts of what government does, Department of Health Professions, one of their jobs is to provide the prescription monitoring program, which is if you ever had to get like any sort of opioid or whatever for post-surgery, you have to show them your license, right? And then eventually it was like Sudafed, you had to show them the license, and then all sorts of other things. But like whenever you have to show that license, it goes through this government, register to make sure that it's capturing between any pharmacy that's out there, right? Prescription monitoring program. We were in the process of actually moving their equipment from some old stuff to something new. We were calling it transformation, right? Like any good project, we gave a nice name to it. And we were going through this process of getting them upgraded and such. And when we were in it, we found out that somebody had actually been in the environment. But what they had done is they had encrypted the database for the prescription monitoring program, sent a ransom note in the form of a web page that popped up on every pharmacies in the state that went to open up and register, like when somebody came up to swipe their license that would register, like they went to do that and all they got was this ransom message that said, hey, we have all of your data. If you want it back, it's going to cost you $10 million, right? So it was a really interesting scenario to be in. Now, I got to know the FBI very well, but realistically, like what ended up happening is because we had backups for data in there, we didn't lose that information. Now, granted, they had access to that information, which mostly consisted of driver's license numbers. There were a few SSNs in there, and I won't go into the intricacies of how that happens, but there was some SSNs in there. All the data breach notifications went out and everything else. It cost us somewhere about $500,000, which is not really all that much for a breach, right? But that particular scenario was one of the first ones that there was any sort of ransom held with, any sort of like demand made where they were looking for some sort of payment. Now, what's interesting is this was pre-Bitcoin, right? So the only way for them to get the money was for us to figure out how to wire it to them. So we're trying to trap them into actually telling us, give us your bank account, give us something, but they wouldn't do it. I think they figured out that they were in over their head with whatever it is that they did. But it was a really interesting, exercise that was out there. And again, being the first one, it made a lot of news. There was a lot of information about it. So ransomware, that's generally what it is. They take your data, they hold it for ransom, say you got to pay us a bunch of money, you're not going to get back. Could be data, could be access to systems, anything that's out there. But the idea is that it's software that's supposed to hold you for ransom. So that's what happened in Colonial Pipeline. Somebody compromised VPN credentials. This is the #1 way that people are getting in today's. People don't use good cyber hygiene for multi-factor authentication, and generally they'll be able to guess a password and get into the environment somewhere. They were then able to basically, once they got in there, critical infrastructure is unfortunately not very well maintained because it's a big deal about changing critical infrastructure, right? You deploy these physical devices out in the environment, it's a real big pain in the butt to update them, right? And I'm sure a bunch of you know this already, but because of that, that means that they tend to be rife with vulnerabilities and issues where you can actually access resources and such on them pretty quickly. Rapid lateral movement means they're able to get into one and then spread out from there. And then, of course, the encryption capabilities. It was easy to encrypt some of the data on there because it's not a lot of data, and they were able to do that, across the board. And then that resulted in them operationally shutting down because they didn't want to have the infection spread beyond, where it was. Those decisions are really hard to make. Another example in Virginia, one of the hospitals that I was working at, there was a worm that was going around where we had a compromise in a system. We had to shut down the whole hospital, prevent it from spreading to the rest of the hospital systems. Well, we don't run hospitals that I would say are like the normal medical hospitals everywhere. There tend to be like, some of these are criminal hospitals. So it was a little bit dicey about what that actually means for shutting it down and what the impact was going to be both to the physicians as well as the people. So like you're taking some big, risks. And this is a good example of critical infrastructure risk that you're kind of trying to prevent and deal with, is to say, when you shut these things down, there's a real big impact to them. When you shut down hospitals, there's a real big impact to them. There's some really great like movie dramatizations or even show dramatizations for anybody that watches Grey's Anatomy. There's kind of a funny one that was out there a few years ago. And then, of course, they always had good music background in that too. But the idea is that you want to end up making sure that whatever critical infrastructure is you're dealing with, you're set up to be able to consider failure, and it has to include the cyber component of failure. This ransomware thing will become more and more of an issue. Once somebody gets in, it's a big problem to get out. And generally what happens is you are pressured into paying the ransom in these circumstances. So when somebody understands that you're taking over critical infrastructure, they are able to push you to pay for it. And that's exactly what happened in Colonial Pipeline. Once they realized that they shut down the pipeline, the ransom went from something that was manageable to many millions of dollars, right? And they had to pay it because they weren't sure what was going to happen if they didn't, right? So even though they were going to recover all of their stuff, they still didn't know what was going to happen if they, didn't pay it.